So recently a viewer asked me to cover the topic of controllers, managers, and Singleton objects. And so I just wanted to take a moment to go over how I handle this in my projects. This is actually one of the easiest and most straightforward implementations I have, so this will be a nice and short video. So the entry point of every project I have is an object called objc game. The C in objc stands for controller. So every controller object I will name objc controller name, and I will also mark it as persistent. So every controller exists and persists throughout the entirety of the game. As I mentioned, this is the entry point of the project. So if I open up my first room, which is titled room init, the only object that's placed in here is the objc game. So I place this in the top left corner, mark it as persistent, it spawns in and kicks everything off. So we can start looking at how this project processes, manages the entire game loop just by looking at this game controller. So let me go ahead and open up the game controller and we can take a look at the create event. Now the first thing I'll point out is that there's nothing here that prevents another game controller from ever spawning. And this is where the Singleton design pattern would be implemented as a way to enforce that there's only ever one game controller. But really, I don't need to handle this. I just make sure that there's only ever one game controller. And same with all the other controllers. If I took a look at my spawn controller, here we can see that there again is no logic to prevent another spawn controller from ever existing. And same with the world controller. None of my controllers do anything to prevent another controller from spawning. But again, this is a non-issue because I place only one game controller in the room manually, very explicitly, so that it is unlikely that I am to do that again by accident. And in the create event, which only runs once, the beginning of the game, one time only ever, I spawn all of the rest of the controllers, and every other controller is marked as persistent. So every controller gets created right at the beginning of the game, and they persist throughout the entirety of the project. Now, one objection to this implementation would be a performance concern, because we may not need every controller to persist throughout the entirety of the project. And this I handle just by activating and deactivating controllers or moving them into appropriate states when necessary. So again, I don't have to worry about performance. And again, I don't need to do anything complex like implement another design pattern in order to prevent these objects from spawning because, well, here it is. This is everything. So this is all I do for implementing controllers and managers in the game project. But let's say I wanted to implement some sort of Singleton design pattern. How would I go about doing that? Well, I kind of do this in another system that I implement in these projects called behaviors and behavior managers. I'll cover this in a future video, but I wanted to showcase how I would take what I've implemented in these behavior managers and implement them if I wanted to control only one instance of controller objects. So for the sake of experimentation, let me go ahead and create a new object. I'm going to call this objc tutorial. All right, so this will be a tutorial controller. This will be responsible for introducing the player to game mechanics and controlling things like sequencing, cutscenes, dialogue, and all of the help tips. I'm going to go ahead and open up this object, and first thing I want to do is mark it as persistent. Then I will go to my game controller and I will create the instance. I will come back to the controller and I will add a create event. So inside of objc tutorial, inside the create event, I'm going to go ahead and implement a Singleton pattern. Now, I haven't researched to see if this is the best implementation, but this is one that I just came up with randomly one day and it worked. And I've been using it for a few weeks now. And even if this isn't the best implementation, I think it'll show you a nice little trick that you could potentially use for other use cases in your project. So here's what we'll do. We want to enforce that there can only ever be one objc tutorial object. Now, there's a couple different ways we could do this. The first instinct is to start counting the number of instances that exist for the object index objc tutorial. And if that number ever exceeds more than one, then we would destroy it. And that's fine. We could do that. But I sometimes find this implementation to be a little tedious. So here's what I'm going to do. I want to assign a reference of this tutorial controller object to a global variable. Global tutorial controller equals self. Now we have a global variable called tutorial controller, and it's equal to this object. All we have to do is, before we assign this, is check if variable struct exists global tutorial controller and global tutorial controller not equal to self. Then we will show error global tutorial controller already exists, and we will close the game. So the reason I'm showing this is because I want to point out something kind of interesting that you can do with GameMaker. Remember that everything in GameMaker is a struct, and this includes our global variable. A lot of times we say global.variable equals whatever, and we forget what that actually means. What we're doing is we're actually assigning a new value inside of our global struct, and that global struct you can just happen to reference anywhere in the game. So because of that, we can actually use struct operations on the global struct to do things like check if a value has been written to it. So here I can say if variable struct exists, well, what's the struct we want to check? The global struct. We can see if the key tutorial controller exists inside of that struct. If it does, then we will move on to the next line of our conditional statement. We will check to see that it's not equal to self. So if it doesn't exist in the global struct, then we will immediately fail this condition and we will assign ourselves and move on. But if it does exist and we are the tutorial controller, then again, we will fail that controller and we'll move on to the rest of the create event. If it does exist and that reference is not equal to ourself, then we throw the error. Technically, if I wanted to be a little more efficient with this, I would assign this as the ID. It's a little bit easier of a comparison. So here, again, the reason I'm pointing this out is because we can do this nice little trick using the global scope and variable struct operations to check to see if this instance has been referenced before. And now if I wanted to, I could create a macro. I could say tutorial is global tutorial controller. And now I just happen to have a nice macro reference for this tutorial controller. So in the future, if I wanted to reference like tutorial, start tutorial with a difficulty for beginners, then I could call this method from anywhere in the project, and that would be totally appropriate. Keep in mind, this is a global controller, so I should be able to reference it from anywhere in the project, and this is a nice implementation to do so. Now, one of the things we could do is if we didn't want to crash the game, instead, we could just show a debug message here, and we could just exit out of the create event. This would allow the rest of the project to continue to run, and we wouldn't have to worry about crashing the project. But I tend to like to crash the project because I should never have two controller objects to begin with. So throwing an error is a good way for me to make sure that I can fix whatever is actually causing the problem of two controller objects existing at the same time anyways. All right, that's it for this tutorial. Like I said, nice and short. As I mentioned at the beginning, I keep my implementation very simple, but let me know what you guys do in the comments down below. Do you implement a singleton design pattern, or do you have any other tricks to enforce the existence of only one controller object? Or do you do it the way that I do and just assume that there's only ever going to be one controller object? I like that solution because it's the easiest, but there's always pros and cons to any solution, so there's no right or wrong answer. Let me know which one you guys like best, and I'll see you in the next one.